مرحبا، سامعيني؟ يعطيكم العافية. شكرا لحضوركم، وبنرحب فيكم وبنرحب بضيفتنا الفنانة إيمان حرام اللي بنشكرها على تلبية الدعوة إنها تكون معنا في هذا اللقاء، وبنشكرها على مشاركتها في معرضنا الحالي نثر من الجذور. للي ما بيعرف عن المعرض بس سريعا بدي أحكي، المعرض بيتناول 3 قضايا رئيسية أو 3 محاور أساسية: قضايا الزراعة والتربة والغذاء، قضايا السياسات العمرانية، وقضايا الموارد المائية المحدودة في الأردن، من تنسيق المعرض من تنسيق رنا بيروتي، وبمشاركة 21 فنانة وفنان من ضمنهم طبعا الفنانة إيمان حرام. بدي أعطي مقدمة سريعة عن إيمان قبل ما أعطيها المجال تبلش بالحوار. إيمان حرام فنانة فلسطينية كندية متعددة التخصصات. ما بعرف إذا سامعيني جميعا. فنانة فلسطينية كندية متعددة التخصصات، تتمحور ممارستها الفنية حول الصورة الفوتوغرافية كمحرك أساسي في عملها البحثي. خلال العقد الماضي أصبحت الصور الأرشيفية بالنسبة لإيمان بمثابة نقطة ارتكاز وتحفيز في رحلتها الاستقصائية، من خلال التعمق في قراءة هذه الوثائق البصرية والاستجابة لها بالتدخل أو الدعم البحثي بأشكال أخرى، نصية، صوتية، أو عبر الوثائق اللحظية أو غيرها من الأشكال. تهدف إيمان من خلال ممارستها الفنية إلى إلقاء الضوء على التواريخ غير المحكية التي طمست أو تم التستر عليها ضمن المؤامرات الاستعمارية والاستيطانية بغرض النهب والسلب. عرضت أعمالها ضمن فعاليات جماعية وفردية في العديد من المحافل العربية والعالمية، من ضمنهم الأردن، تركيا، فلسطين، إسبانيا وكندا وسوريا. وأكملت إيمان دراستها في العمارة وتاريخ الفن، وتقيم حاليا بين مدينتي مونتريال وعمان.
مرة تانية يعني بحب أحاوركم بالعربي، هاي لغتي الأم، بس آسفة إنه ما عنديش القدرة أعمل الطرح كله بالعربي بعد 40 سنة بالغرب ودراستي وحياتي. هذا الجواب بالنسبة للنقطة الفلسفية. أنا عندي قلق بالنسبة لهالموضوع. مهم الفكر اللي يطلع بأي لغة مش مهم. بدي أقول لكم كيف يعني I will start by threading this project, how it started. It really started as a personal journey. It started during COVID. It didn't start as a project, it started as a personal quest to somehow debunk the myth by the colonizer and the settler colonizer that not only they greened the land, but that they also made the citrus crop or the citriculture where it was in Palestine, that they built it from, they brought it to the level that it was. So my first approach, and this is what framed my research, is to go towards reading about when did the orange arrive in Palestine. It was a bit of a Don Quixotic pursuit in a way, trying to trace the journey of the orange into the land. And the other question that framed the readings during the last 2 years were, why was Palestine important, beside the ethical, moral issue of it, in the emotional and the moral, being an indigenous person to the land, but why were colonial powers after this piece of land? And particularly in the 19th century, Palestine meant different things to different people at different times in history, but why was it so fundamental in the 19th and early 20th century to be stolen? So, are we going to do simultaneous translation or? Okay. So there are several things that what started this quest also, the archival photographs. We know that there's a lot of, I found a lot of literature about citrus by American, British government officials, people who were coming to survey Palestine in the 19th and 20th century. There was tremendous amount of material, and not just about the geography, but about our crops, our resources. They understood everything, every little plant that was in the land, the geography. And when I was looking for Arabic resources about citrus, I found an enormous number of articles, but they were very much nostalgic, about reminiscing about the loss of paradise, Palestine as this land of bounty, but there was no statistical studies from the Palestinian side or the Palestinian Arab side about citrus. which was really astonishing considering, and here I'm getting ahead of myself, that at one point, this constituted 80% of the aggregate export of Palestine combined. It was the most important pillar of the Palestinian economy, not just the economy. And I was not off because there was a recent book that came out, I still have not really co-authored by a Palestinian and Israeli writer, saying that this has been the most understudied topic, citriculture of Palestine. And it just came out last year, at the end of last year. I mentioned the resources at the end. So there was a gap between what documentary photographs were showing us, and I would, yes, you can see the images on it. This is a photograph from the 19th century, from the Matson collection. It was taken an estimated time between end of 19th century until before World War I. And it showed this immense bounty, I mean, these stretches of land that had citriculture everywhere. And then there were, you know, the photographs here, these photographs have some interventions in them, but there were the photographs of all the people who worked in the citriculture. Also, again, from either Matson collection or Rad collection. Saying that, I could not find a lot of photographs, although Ilyas Sambar says Palestine and Egypt in the 19th century were the most two photographed places in the East. So where was the material? It was astounding not to be able to have access to a city. We know that it had a vital history, but we don't have access to it as Palestinian. Whether it's hidden or destroyed, the material was not there. On the other hand, we know that the Palestinian artists were visiting the orange as a symbol, using it as a symbol of the land, of identity, of resistance. It was very present as an iconography, as a fruit in its layers of representation and its layers of meaning. There was no shortage of it, and this is just an extract of what artists have done over the years from the archive of the Palestine Poster Project, but there's a lot more than that. And then I came across the work of Mahmoud Yazbek, who wrote in 2018 a book about the history of Java. And it was really fundamental. It was called مدينة البرتقال يافا حضارة ومجتمع. He covered the history of the city. He didn't necessarily talk about citrus except in a chapter, but he gave me a grounding and a foundation about Java and its citrus crop that, yes, there were from the early 19th century, Java had its citrus crop minimum from the early 19th century. Because after the Napoleonic invasion of 1799, Abu Nabut, the wali of Jaffa, who was kind of متسلم Jaffa between 1805 and 1819, he decided his two priorities were to fortify the port city after the Napoleonic invasion that practically destroyed the city and brought it to the ground, and to plant citrus, which was, for me, a fantastic or like incredibly unusual discovery. Why would the Mutsallam Yafa, just when the country was, or the city was emerging from the ashes, decide to focus on this crop? So it stopped me, this piece of information, that there must be, he must have known something to start with citrus as a crop that's meant for export also. Not for local consumption, but for export. And sure enough, I want to give you a sense of what Jaffa, from some quotations here, how it was described about at least the quotations that were available, resources that were available. It was being described as, you know, the orchards of Jaffa are known all over the East. Not even in California and Florida, and that was gone through later, have the skill of the horticulturists or people who have the knowledge of how to work in this crop. And this is coming from Benjamin Gordon, these are the Orientalists who are also coming and looking at the land with a motivation somehow. It's not neutral, and still they were praising this bounty. Mahmoud Yazbek tells us in the 19th century, in the latter part, 1880s of the 19th century, according to the staff of the American consulate, Jaffa had 500 bayaras, or orange groves, and over 800,000 trees. To put this in perspective, this is a huge number. It may seem not huge. California, before, let me see. People were coming from California, horticulturists, people who were in this industry, coming and doing a survey of citrus in the Mediterranean. And they were traveling Malta, Sicily, Spain, to obtain some knowledge about citrus crop, to take it back to California with them. Because California was, relative to Jaffa, was coming almost 3/4 of a century later in planting its citrus. And there was the reputation that Jaffa, they came up with a report that the Jaffa orange has no equivalent. It's the most remarkable of their finding. So, going back, why I'm bringing this number, while Jaffa had 800,000 trees and 500 bayaras, California in 1850 had 1,800 trees. And in 1870, it had 30,000 trees. And California is the second state after Florida in terms of citrus culture. It is literally the state, or even actually Orange County, the county that built its wealth on orange. Literally, the historians tell you California, orange came after citrus in terms of the value and how the wealth of the county. It built its wealth on citrus crop. And one I will get to later, why was there rising interest in citrus that was creating what was called in the US the citrus rush. People were, the crop was just exponentially exploding in various countries that have the weather that allows them to plant that crop. California in 20 years went from 30,000 trees to 1 million trees. There was, and in Italy, also in Sicily, the crop was going through exponentially. That I have to add, I just made the discovery during the end of my research, which verified for me that I was on the wrong track. There are 3 researchers who came up with a study that single-handedly citrus crop was the reason for the birth of the mafia, Italian mafia. At the end of the 19th century, the growth was so phenomenal that it basically, this is how the mafia developed. So I have to just address some friends here and say, remember when I said, can you contribute to my orange project? And you said, there's nothing we can say about oranges. So this is an ode to, with a wink and a smile to you. There's a lot to be said about the orange. And it's much more than trading Mercedes cars for orange. The story is really, really big. And for me, it felt like there is more to nostalgia. There's more to the idea that we're trading cars for citrus. But why were we trading cars for citrus? Why were people giving us Mercedes for our oranges? We had to go beyond and that anecdote and ask the question. And Jaffa orange, they were completely sort of interested in its qualities because it was an orange that could be transported before this steamship. We're not talking about transport in refrigerated cars. We're talking steamship in the 19th century. We're talking camels. This is an orange that could almost handle 1 month in extreme temperatures, crossing the sea and arrive at destination in England intact. And this was part of why it changed the history of the world. It's among the 50 food that changed the history of the world because it was very important at that time for this crop to arrive to the destination, which is the empire. So here I'm starting to want to link it with geography. The Jaffa was the center of orange exporting industry. but it also has daily railway service to Egypt via Suez Canal. Now, this really is very important, this thread. It has daily service to Egypt via Suez Canal. This link to Egypt was absolutely vital, and I will come to later, because that's also answered the question why Palestine was important. We okay? Need translation? In 1875, and that's, I don't trust necessarily all the sources. I mean, that's Aaron Aronson, and he's an avowed Zionist, we know. But he is telling us, at least from his survey, he was coming to survey Palestine in 1910 and all its crop and bounty. And he tells us that in 1875, Jaffa started to export to England. And now alone, even if it started to export to England late, England was taking almost 3/4 of our crop. Why? Why England? Why not other places? That also became like, why England? Okay, I know we are sending some to Anatolia. We were sending to Egypt, curiously enough, Syria and Egypt, but Egypt. But then 1882, Egypt fell under colonial rule of the British Empire. So whatever we were selling to Britain and we were selling to Egypt, we were selling it all to Britain in a sense. Britain was this empire who at one point understood that citrus literally was the lifeline, its life as a maritime empire. Why? Because of the discovery of citrus as a cure for scurvy. Scurvy was this disease that literally devastated, they say it was the most lethal disease in Western maritime history. Why Western? Because it's associated with the age of discovery. It's associated with the time when the new empires or the new colonial powers were starting to travel across continent to discover new lands or in search of ways of getting to trade routes that were before in the previous world order were in the hands of the Mamluks. And so with the Portuguese invasion that came, the Portuguese was the first empire, and then the Dutch, and then the French and the Brits. But during a period of 300 years from the time of 1492, from Columbus' journeys and adventures onward, scurvy killed 2 million sailors. For maritime empires, it was the plague of the oceans. It was, they factored 50% death rate on their fleet when they send expeditions. And you can imagine if someone says tomorrow, oh, we discovered a cure for cancer, and it's just taking an orange. And the rush that it would create if everyone really knows that this orange is going to eliminate the cancer if you take an orange a day. This is the comparison. Again, here I just want to, the Suez Canal, okay, opened in 1869. And it allowed a shortcut from between the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean by cutting the distance by 7,000 kilometers. This is also really tied to citrus, because these journeys, when we're talking still steamship, they came at a cost for the empire. To send their men across to India, to China, to the Spice Islands, these were very long expeditions. And at that point, okay, I'm going to get ahead of myself. I bring back Java, and then I go back to scurvy. Java, the French and the Brits were looking at Palestine as this land. For the French, Jaffa and Palestine is for the French, it was a way to undercut the British, to undercut their route, to undercut them in Egypt. If they can get to Jaffa, then they can basically become sort of the weak point of the British Empire in Egypt. And then that's why they started their the Egyptian invasion and then it failed, and then they went after Java, the French. And in one of their reports, they say, Java is very important for us, and it's after Port Said, because it allows us not only to create trade along this coast, but it would be a port in which we can resupply our navy, and we can also remove the danger of the English station in Cyprus, and which gives them a commercial advantage over England. The geography here, I want to say that the geography at one point will intersect with the crop, will intersect with curvy to create this lethal combination for something that's almost tragic situation for Java. The bounty becomes the curse. Here, and military specialists say, Egypt is our master interest in the East. To say that is to say Palestine is our master interest in the East. For Palestine has always been the key to Egypt. And Egypt is not valuable in and of itself, but it's valuable as the channel of communication to India. If we lose Egypt, we lose India. So this becomes sort of central for the Brits, and how they justify further the Brits, that's why Palestine is important for them. To protect Egypt, they have to take Palestine. And it's all really because of the trade routes, because this little tiny land of Palestine in between, it's literally, Egypt is the Achilles heel of the empire. And they justified that Palestine and ultimately Mesopotamia are the two nodes that are crucial to protect Egypt. So here the geography also, I'm just going back to geography and then tying it later. So you see this entire arc, where this is most of the areas that are the core areas of the British Empire. But the sea is central to it, and being able to cross these oceans, which before you had to go around Ras al-Raja al-Saleh, the Cape of Good Hope, now you go through Suez Canal, but you still have to cross the Indian Ocean. And again, it was the time of steamship, where travel was long and scurvy was still lethal. Here, just to give you an idea for those who don't know much about scurvy, it was associated with the age of exploration, and I would call it the age of colonization, because it was, as one historian tells us, more men died on sea from scurvy than combat, shipwreck, storms combined. It was really like the bane of the oceans for maritime empires. And ships could only stay for a very short time in the sea before sailors, only 6 or 8 weeks, before they develop symptoms of scurvy. So these long voyages across the oceans meant without a cure, they are not doable, or if they are doable, they're going to come at an enormous cost. And very often, entire fleets will come back at 1/10 of their count. In 1753, James Lind discovers and issues a treatise of scurvy. It's a 400, 500-page document. He only writes 5 paragraphs, just few lines, inferring that citrus is one of the possible cures. So it took a long time for the Navy, the British Navy, to apply his cure. And in 1795, they decided to give citrus to all their sailors across the Navy. Historians say this remedy has changed the course of history. Like literally, they have one historian, his name is Stephen Bowen, he says, no single food can have changed the destiny of a nation like citrus did. Because it allowed men during the Napoleonic invasion, it allowed Britain to create a blockade to protect itself from Napoleonic invasion for 20 years, where sailors were literally on sea for months, sometimes years on end, without returning to land. And they say without this treat of lemon, giving their sailors lemon juice, it would not have been possible. And it would have possibly, Napoleon would have possibly invaded, but they were invaded Egypt. But it was possible because they were able to stay in the sea for so long and protect the land. And here we're told how it was, Great Britain was able to defend itself because this little cure that they decided to administer to their sailors, where other nations came much later. The Americans decided, oh, no, this is a joke. And they still had, scurvy was rampant in their mining fields, in their shipping fleet, in the Civil War, because they were calling the Brits the limeys, because like, oh, the British are giving citrus juice, or these limeys, as if it's voodoo. And so, just to create a context, in the 20th century Palestine, this little land, no, I have to go back to something, why Palestine was critical. During the war with Napoleon, Britain had to supply, it used to go to Spain as one of the primary suppliers, but they were at war with Spain. So they had to go to the Caribbean to get their lime to supply their their navy during the Napoleonic blockade. So suddenly Jaffa, it has all this bounty, and it's next door, and it's close to Egypt, and it's going to allow them, it has what they need most, their lifeline, that they can supply to maintain this kind of their vitality and lack of disruption for their navy as a maritime empire. They were not going to take a chance. And when the crop was there, and the location and the geography of it also, combined with the geography of Palestine being the defense of Egypt. These two combinations, I would propose, came to this report from the chief horticultural of in Britain, 1931, he's saying, every endeavor must be made to retain and enhance the greatest asset the country has. And on a last note, I'd say vitamin C was only discovered in 1930, and only its use as a vitamin came much later in the 20th century, and the Albert Georgi won the Nobel Prize for it in 1937. So I will end with this presentation and leave you with a lot of thought, and I hope a lot of questions, because your questions will feed my reflection even further in the future. This is not a project that has finished here. It's على قولة دكتور أنيس أنت مندورة للبردقان. And this is I can't top this one. So, Allah يحفظكم.
Is the orange tree indigenous to Palestine, or is it exported?
There, some historians say the citron. Citron is the oldest. It is the root. It's not the subspecies. It's the root. The true species is the oldest fruit in Palestine. So citron, the base is there. We have had it from thousands of years. The sweet fruit, the sweet orange, there are contestation when it came to Palestine. And that's where it's not settled for me. It was a form of mutation. The sweet orange is, they would graft a type of orange on, and the Jaffa orange is grafted on sweet lime, not on the citron. But it's brought to Palestine. At least the literature, we don't know for sure if it came from, some people say, oh, it's the Portuguese, which I don't buy, because I'm finding accounts saying that we may have had it with the Fatimids. I mean, originally orange is from the Himalayas, China, India, the fruit itself, the origin. When it arrived in Palestine, the sweet orange came much later. It's a mutation that developed in the 15th century. People say it came from Portugal to the Middle East. I think this is one of the mythologies, because we found there was a document that was found in the Vatican showing that there was sweet orange before the Portuguese went to the Spice Islands. It was in 1479. The Portuguese came to 1498 to the Spice Islands. So I would say, and it was in Sicily. So I would say possibly when the Fatimids came to Sicily, they possibly brought that fruit with them. We have to go back to the Arab sources from the 10th century. I really think that's where there's a lot of interest for me to even dig back. But you have to sift like a needle in a haystack to sift through these resources, and that's what I'm doing, trying to dig and see who wrote about citrus in Palestine and when. But this is a very long process of discovery that's still to come. But I would tend to say in the 10th century, I'm more with the propositions that the sweet orange have arrived to Jaffa and Palestine in the 10th century. Now, Palestine, by the way, have oranges in other places, but in the 19th century, it was central to have it mainly in Jaffa because of the proximity to the port. It could not be, let's say, in Gaza. It could not be far away because transport was camels, and it had to be quickly loaded from the closest point on the camel to the port to ship. So Jaffa that's why it became known as the mother of oranges. In the 20th century, there were further development, and Gaza started to have its own, and Ariha, and there are other regions of Palestine. But in the 19th century, it was really, because of transport modes, it was very important.
حدا عنده سؤال ثاني؟ عنده سؤال؟
What's the quantity of oranges that used to be exported to England?
In 1875, we are told of the 600,000 or 700,000 cases, England was taking 500 to 600 cases. So technically, they were taking most of our crop, and then the rest was going to Egypt. But in 82, Egypt was England. Very small amount. And then in the 20th century, the British sort of intervened to organize the citrus crop, and then they created the citrus board, and they tried to control the export of the crop. And that's another history altogether. I wanted to just focus on the root before the arrival of the Israeli and the Jewish, let's say, labor and the Jewish citriculture, because they were starting after the 1922 mass migration. The Jews started to invest in citrus. It was like the most profitable crop in Palestine, and they actually took over a good part of the industry in the co-ops that they created, and some of the disadvantages that you read about it in the newspaper, the Arab newspapers, how England is being unfair in its dealing with the two sides and empowering the Israeli citrus crop to take over. Sure. But the numbers grew much. That number was for 1875. At the beginning of the 20th century, Spain was worried about the competition from us because we were almost at par with Spain. And in between the two wars, the reports say that while Spain crop was even, Jaffa orange growth saw a 360% growth. It was phenomenal. So between the wars also, it was very important, this crop, to feed the navies of the powers that were fighting. I mean, again, we have to remember, vitamin C was still not discovered.
شكرا كثير على المحاضرة الرائعة. يعني يمكن قصة فلسطين وبرتقال لفت نظري سوريا القلق، يعني برتقال فلسطينيين عالج جيوش بريطانية مكافأة إن أعطوا البلد لا فبس سؤالي أنا إنه هل ممكن تتابعي ريسيرش وتشوفي هال 500 بيارة اللي أنا بعتقد أكثر إحنا بنعتقد لما نسمع كل أهالينا كان عندهم بيارات وكان في تواضع
لا هي 500 بالقرن ال 19 بال 1880
بحثك ممكن يتابع شو صار بهذه البيارات؟ هل لا زالت موجودة ولا أموال حطوا غيرها ولا كذا؟ يعني تابعينا قصة فلسطين مع البرتقال.
أنا مهتمة كثير وهلا في مثلا موسوعة علي البواب، مع انه بس في 11 صفحه عن بلدان فلسطين من اصل 3000 صفحه، بس على المقله التي سمى العيال اللي كان عندها بيارات، فبالنسبه لي هي ارضيه ابدا منها كمان العائلات اللي كان عندها يعني البيارات المهمه والكبيره بفلسطين.
الزراعه انه كل الكولونايزرز والسيتلرز اللي اجوا تعلموا كيف يديروا بالهم من الفلسطينيين على اشجار البرتقال، فهي كمان كثير مهم يعني.
We were in the 19th century. Palestine was essentially an agrarian society. It was not an urban society, and also we have to remember that in 1832 to 1840, after the Napoleonic invasion, we had a lot of immigration from Egypt. So to Jaffa, Jaffa had the know-how of also the Egyptian and the Palestinian farmer together, combined together. And we were under Egyptian rule for 10 years, 1832 to 1840. So there was also a lot of influx of labor, capital, know-how during that period. So there's also that history to be discovered. I mean, there's for me a part that I want to go to Egypt next and dig some of the resources there, because the other part of the story is spread in another country. It's not just in Palestine, and our resources are destroyed, they're burned. So where do you find the rest of the story? And I think part of it is in Egypt for sure.
I think that Mahmoud yesterday told me this, or I read it in his book, I'm not sure, that the export of Palestinian oranges to England reached about 50 million fruits.
Yes, oh yes. In the 1880 alone, we were at 36 million oranges. Oh, and in 1880, we're talking 19th century. In the 20th century, our numbers even went much higher. Yeah, by all means. I think I have the figures from one of the in one of the newsletter من شو بسموها بالعربي عم بجرب اتذكر ريبورت عن الزراعه كيف عم بيحكوا اعلان نسيت لساني مربوط فإن they talk about in 1913 and to 1914, we're talking just before the war, we've reached about million and almost 2 million and 3/4 boxes, not oranges. And it was taken at the time, only during the World War I. A good part of it was taken between Russia, Masr, Turkey, Egypt, not just the British Empire, because also Palestine was at war. So we were also giving the empire some of our oranges. But the numbers were much higher in the 20th century. We reached easily, 50 million. I would not be surprised, even more. Yeah. But I said, I'm not carrying all the numbers in my head, but 19th century, we were way ahead of California, which became the largest, the second state after Florida for citrus crop. And as I said, it built its wealth on that fruit. Any other questions?
شكرا على المحاضرة عظيمة. كان بدي أسألك بس المحاضرة اللي انحكت اليوم هي تسلسل تاريخي عن البرتقال، بس انت ما استعملتيها عشان تكتبي لنا بحث تاريخي، عملتيها عشان عرض عشان معرض فن بصري. فانا حابب اعرف هذا التسلسل هو اللي جربتي تحكي لنا اياه بالمعرض، لانه في مواد ارشيفيه بالمعرض بس في كمان صور في عمل فني. طبعا مركزيه البرتقالي موجوده بالعمل الفني، فانا حابب بس افهم كيف هذا الحكي المتسلسل صار فن بصري بمعرض.
Actually, excellent question. الحاجات الجواب بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي؟ عربي حلو. السؤال جدا رائع. هو أنا مش مشروع بحثي تاريخي، كان المشروع بدأ كأنه أنا فنانة عم بستعمل أدوات الباحث التاريخي لأعرف قصة البرتقال. وأنا بالبداية يعني كان عندي عمل معرض جاي قبل هالمعرض قبل الكوفيد، كان كل الصور في 30 قطعة بس صور، ما فيش أي بحث أبداً. وكنت عم بتابع قصة البرتقال بطريقة فطرية، يعني فعلاً مندورة إنه بطريقة فطرية، إنه من القصص اللي بتسمعها واللي محكية لإلك، بس ما كان عندي أي شيء من هالمعلومة. لما بلشت أعمل هالقراءة، القراءة كتير تشعبت وصارت يعني أنا مش عم بعمل فيها بحث تاريخ، كنت عم بقرأ. وبالأخير حسيت إنه أحسن مساحة لما القيمة شي أبروتش مي لأعرض يعني أشارك بالعمل، قلت لها أنا مش عارفة كيف بدي أحول بحث لمعرض، لأنه التقاطع تبع اثنين هو كان ثراء هائل بالنسبة إلي، لأنه أرجاني مثل البلايند سبوتس اللي أنت لو بتطلع عليها كمؤرخ. طب المؤرخين تبعنا لهلا ما شافوا هالنقطة، يعني أنت عم بتشوفها من مسار مؤرخ ولا أنثروبولوجي ولا فلسفي ولا شهر. المساحة الفنية هي مساحة أنا بعدها convergence space، يعني هي مساحة تقاطع، أنت بتقدر تروح من هالمساحة وتروح للفلسفة للأدب للتاريخ وتاخذ منه وتصبي هالمساحة وتخلق هالمزيج اللي كان كتير أصعب. لو ما كان المعرض موجود يمكن صعب أعمل هالمحاضرة، بس أنا حاسة إنه العالم شافت المعرض it's a spatial concession, it's a spatial presentation، يعني وهي تقدر تعمل الحلقات الوسط تبعها، ومش إنه كتير تغلبت actually أعمل هالتسلسل هيك، لأنه هي مش متسلسل هيك، هي شبكة، وهي شبكة مثل ما بقول باتريك وولف، الاستعمار شبكة. It's really settler colonialism, or colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. And once we understand this basis, we have to understand the structure. لازم نفهمها. وبتشوف ساعتها قديش مشعر اللي صار بفلسطين صار قبل 500 سنة بجزر التوابل. جزر التوابل أخذوا النتمج، باعوا هالداتش بدلوها مع الإنجليز وقالوا لهم خذوا منهاتن بس خلونا جزيرة النتمج، خلونا فلسطين، إحنا بدنا إياها. هاي الحالة بالنسبة لي رجعتني لفلسطين، إنه إذا في جزيرة صغيرة بآخر الدنيا إجوا الداتش قالوا لهم إنه للبريطان خذوا منهاتن قبيلة، معناتها فلسطين مش كتير بعيدة عن الموضوع. يعني crops, cities and countries were stolen because of their crop. And their native population were completely destroyed because of a single crop sometimes. And the lesson comes from somewhere else, but not necessarily only from Palestine. The colonization of others, what happened to others in distant geographies, in distant time, brought me back to Palestine, because there was also, what happened there was not entire, societies were annihilated. They were just to control nutmeg. We have parallel situations that recurred again and again. And in that sense, I just want to add, the art space becomes absolutely pivotal, because it allows you to see, open up all the blinders and see, in a way, networks, and what people would say, it's an Archimedean point of view, it's a bird's eye view. You can see from above and then suddenly see the connections that are otherwise hidden when you are looking at things just laterally and from the prism of one discipline. ما بعرف إذا جاوبتك. I hope. عافيك.
يمكن هم صارت السؤال مني، بس أنا بتخيل لو بديك بحث تاريخي كان من صورات الدراسات التاريخية ما كان رهيب.
عيدة 100% absolutely 100% 100%.
الملاحظة الثانية إنه بتخيل في النصف الأول من القرن الثامن عشر أصيبت زراعات البرتقال في يافا بنوع من أنواع الميوتيشن هيك أدى إلى سماكة الغلاف تبع البرتقالي، فتمكن وقتها إنه يقدروا يطلعوها لتوصل لأوروبا، لأنه لا أبعد حتى من أوروبا، وصل لأمريكا. كان هذا الميوتيشن هذا واحد من الأسباب. ملاحظتي الأساسية كانت على لأنه إحنا كفلسطينيين أخذت منا فلسطين وعندنا هذا الهوس بالاستعادة. تخيل لما تتحرر فلسطين في أجزاء كثير من تاريخنا رح ندرسها فنيا وبشكل انترديسيبلينري وبطرق أخرى أكثر هيك رسوخا، زي مثلا القطن. القطن في فلسطين أيام ظهر عمر كان يصدر إلى إنجلترا وأوروبا، يغطي نصف احتياجات المستعمرات الإنجليزية. يعني إحنا مش بس داويناها، لبسناها كمان. مش هذا النفس بس بتخيل إنه
لا، هو كل أنا بقول كل كروب. يعني إحنا إذا بنرجع نحكي من فلسطين من الأرض from the ground up، يعني بنحكي قصة الأرض، بيطلع سردية تاني غير عن الخطاب السياسي. يعني لأنه يعني هي بالأخير it is about resources. colonization is about the theft of resources. the scriptural narrative، القصة الدينية بتيجي بتركب عليها بعدين، لأنه بتشوفها هاي لما راحوا على الإسبان صاروا يقولوا إنه هدول ناس ما عندهم روح، لازم نهذبهم ونسويهم نعم يعني we have to civilize them. وكانت بالوقت ما وصلوا الإسبان للاتين أمريكا كان في ديبيت إذا هدول الناس عندهم روح ولا ما عندهم روح. يعني الاستعمار ببلش يبرر لك كل الوسائل لحتى يستيلي على الأرض. وكانوا يقولوا على الناس الباندانيز اللي بيجوا زر التوابل إنه savages، وأنت بتلاقي الناريتيف شبيه كتير barbarians lazy they are not skilled يعني كمان هاي الإضافة للناريتيف العصرية. then you have to cut through all this kind of bluff and then see really where's the real story. And I think it's about the land. Ultimately, it's about land and its wealth. Because one I don't know if he's not this maybe a surveyor. Well, in Palestine, it has the bounty of the continent. Because its geography, it has the same geography of California, but it's 20 times smaller. It has the same amount of flora and fauna, but it's 20 times smaller. It has a geography of literally of the continent, so it's about resources in a sense. That this small land is a puzzle for some. How is it possible to carry all this bounty in such a small geography? And he was comparing it to Algeria, and he's saying Algeria is 14 times larger and have half of the amount of the wealth of the flora and fauna of Palestine. So I think there's time. We are at a stage where we have to give room for more than just the political سردية السياسية and the political narrative, and narrate the land. I think it's about that. And when by narrating the land, we're narrating the people. بعدين نسرين تفضلي.
شكرا إيمان, and thank you very much for walking us through your journey of research. And that helped us in a way to reconnect with our history and with the land. And the fact that you were able to reclaim this landscape of history and historicity as a fine artist, to me is very significant. So thank you very much. My question is the following. When you worked on the citrus crops, were you able to come across some anecdotes where this culture of the citrus crops helped in shaping and reshaping the culture and subcultures of people in this area, especially in the cuisine? in the feasibility, the sensitivities that they have, in the provision that they developed, and so on and so forth.
Thank you for the question, Wafa. It's
I build on your question. Okay. I'm interested in the reflection on the internal society as well. Thank you for the historical brief. But just to build on her, يعني كيف كان طبيعة المجتمع الزراعي الفلسطيني بموضوع الزراعة البرتقال؟ كيف كانت الثروة في زراعة البرتقال؟ يعني إذا حصلتي على أي مواضيع من هذا الحكي موزعة، كان it looks like it was a huge investment. البيارات يعني أكيد فيها يعني ثروة كبيرة. كيف كانت موزعة هاي الثروة؟ هل عندنا فكرة عن البنية الاجتماعية بحيفا وبيافا بهذاك الوقت؟ هل كانت أميل إلى الطبقية؟ فيها جانب نسمع كبيرة معينة. فأنا just curious أعرف هل كان في تلاقي بين هاي الفئات الطبقية وات وان بوينت كمان، يعني ما بدي اسمي المستعمر او التاجر الاجنبي او الى اخره، لان دائما هاي الطبقات they cross border وبيتعاطفوا مع بعض in a way او لا ما بعرف. بس بدي اسال يعني to what extent do we know the socio-economy of the orange economy in Yaffa?
Yeah, I think to address your question first, Wafa, there's no doubt. At one point I was looking actually if there are أمثال شعبية عن البرتقال. Surprisingly, I found a lot about مثلا olive, but I could not find. I got several books about الأمثال الشعبية. I could not find أمثال شعبية عن البرتقال من فلسطين. And it was again, I'm sure it has seeped into the culture. But one thing one historian said. Orange was a crop that was not planted for sustenance. It was one of the few crops in Palestine that was planted for export. So I don't know, I can only do research. This is another level of the society. What did that mean? If it went for export, what was the relationship of the people with that crop? Is it why we don't have a lot of مثلا أمثال شعبية عنه? This is one thing to consider. For sure, there was the labor issues, and I would say in Nasreen, it was as Mahmoud Yazbek tells us. It's at one point it started small, but then it became, and it started by the locals to create orchards olive groves, not orchards. And then when the word got out that it was very profitable, it started to attract not people who are farmers, but athriya, investors, who are investing in the crop, and they are holding large tracts of land. And they were coming from Lebanon, they were coming from Egypt, they were coming from other towns in Palestine, and looking at it as an investment, because it was a crop, when you start to go large scale, required a lot of labor. It's not like a crop that takes care of itself like zaytun. It required irrigation infrastructure, it requires large tract of land, it required housing the labor on your land. So at one point only the haves could enter it when the game became quite big, and they have to have their network of people who can export it to, like their network of brokers and shippers. There were so many trades connected to it.
The labor was from Jaffa?
Both. Egypt. No, Egypt. Jaffa had half of, they would say, Ali al-Bawab tells us, after the Napoleonic invasion, I would say 70% of the population of Java from 200 some years ago came from Egypt. So also you have this cross-pollination, Egyptian, Palestinian. The Palestinian has the know-how, the farmer, but the Egyptian has also his set of skills. And it was, at one point, yes, there was cheap labor, there was an architect. It's another subject altogether. He talks about the typology of architecture that was built on these farms. They call them ستتناول, in which they would house the laborers in the cheap labor to come and there are like 5 trades tied to the orange grew from the time it was picked up to the time it gets in the box. There are 5 different craftspeople or vocations tied to it. This is all she played.
This is concentrated land ownership. They are land large. قديش البيارة؟ بس البيارة قديش حجمها يعني؟ What's the minimum حجم البيارة؟
I don't know. I mean, here when I went to visit البيارات بالغرب الشمالي كان بي بيارة of 5 dorms can have 1,000 trees. If it's completely بيارة بس then they even one can extrapolate what happened in Yaffa to what's happening in الغرب الشمالي. Then you have these enormous bayaras that try to break the pricing of the small bayaras, and then these people have بدهم يضمنوا المحصول تبعهم بفرق ونص. يعني يضمنوا 1000 شجرة ب 2000 دينار بالسنة. So that the large one can take all their crop and send it outside. But this is another topic. Yes, and I think there was one, I didn't read that book, but I think Shireen Saikari wrote a book called Men of Capital, in which I understand the thesis of it is that men of capital at one point become complicit with the colonizer because they have vested interest in their profits. Yeah. And without necessarily not intending to, they may slip and not pay attention that they are empowering because they want their business to continue and not to be affected by
Who was the controller and the regulator for all this massive export of oranges outside Palestine؟ يعني كان في وزارة زراعة فلسطينية مثلا أو لأنه كان في دورة فعلية للانتداب مين كان منظم لكل هاي التصدير؟
كان أوائل القرن العشرين للفلاح أو المزارع، ما بدي أقول مزارع، وصاحب العمل، لأنه هي كانت بتحسي من يعني الماتيريال اللي قدرت أوصلها بالصحف العربية، وما عنديش كتير يعني، بس كم عدد من للأسف جبتهم من مكتبة إسرائيل نزلتهم، يعني كمان إحنا مش قادرين نوصل لمصادرنا بأريحية. إنه هن بلشوا ينظموا أمورهم أوائل القرن العشرين ويعملوا يجربوا ما يعملوا تعاونيات، بس يعملوا مثل لجان لحتى ما يصير في تفاوت بالأسعار، ما يصيروا التجار يحرقوا أسعار بعض، لا يصير في عندهم مثل كيف قوة ضغط يعني. بس ما كانت منظمة مثل ما لما اجوا اليهود صاروا يعملوا كوبس، ولما اجى البريتش مانديت، وقت البريتش مانديت وعملوا مثل الماركتينج بورد للسيترس، وانه هن كل شيء بيصير عن طريقهم، يعني ما في ولا تاجر فلسطيني او اسرائيلي او يهودي وقتها مش كان اسرائيلي انه يعني الا يمرق عن طريقهم ويساوي اي مثلا تجاره او السعر او الكوميسيون او مين مثلا طريقه الشحن، انه على اساس they want to regulate the industry على اساس it was a banana republic. It was a way to control it حسب التاجر الفلسطيني as a way to undermine and undercut the Palestinian city culture rather than organizing it. But I think it was organic initially. In the 19th century, there was no coordination. Only in the early 20th century, بهذا النيوزلتر 1924 يعني 1924 they're advocating إنه إحنا لازم ننظم أمورنا، لأنه صاروا يشوفوا إنه هلا بلش اليهودي يفوت على الخط ويعني يكون في practices اللي that undercuts the Palestinian farmer، يعني من ناحية إنه كسر السعر والكوتاز. But I cannot profess that I have all the answers. Yani, I really have to stress that I am approaching this topic again as an artist who went to historical documentation. So I may have gaps here and there. The research is still about it's in its infancy. I could spend the rest of my lifetime working on oranges. Lena.
لا سؤال يمكن جاوبتيه بالدقة، يعني ما في دوكيومنتيشن اركايفز من الفلسطينيين يعني اللي تقول هذا عنده بيارة جار عيلة فلان الطويل قديش كانوا يصبوا قديش كانوا ينتجوا.
I am sure فيه I'm sure I think I have يعني for a researcher or مثلا who can be in Palestine accessing, let's say, the National Archive, Israeli archive, regrettably يعني, but they have our archive, that they will come up with all more يعني additional information. This is, for me, it's a global picture, and I can only do the best I can with the resources that I have. But I'm sure if we go to the resources of المحاكم الشرعية, سجلات المحاكم الشرعية, and this is where even every Palestinian historian says it's يعني so important for us to revisit that archive, because accessing the Ottoman archive is accessing our archive. It's the largest archive in the world, the Ottoman archive. It has more than 100 million documents. Yeah, it's the largest. And I once attended, I even met one of the people from here made a talk about it. And he says, Amni, this is your history. By accessing our archive, you're accessing, there are 43 countries that are tied to the Ottoman Empire. By revisiting our archive, you are revisiting your own history. Because at one point, لما كانوا يرموا قصقوصة عثمانيين, not even a small piece of paper, a draft, they were storing it as an archive. Every shred of information was stored as an archive. But sadly, we don't speak the language. Most of our, many of earlier generations, English or French or Arabic, nobody speaks Turkish. There's a new generation maybe that is learning that language, and they will maybe possibly open up that Pandora box to reclaim Palestinian history that has been really decimated.
What you have really introduced and opened is a new window to examine also colonization in Palestine.
That's what I hope. That's what I hope. It's really just just another way of looking at things, يعني, and yeah.
يمكن شوي من الظلم لما نقول انه بلشت الاداره لما اجوا المستعمرين اليهود والكولونايزرز، لانه احنا كمان من قراءاتنا انه كانت التصدير كثير منظم، كان في اداره ذاتيه في فلسطين. حتى اذا بتقرا كتاب تبع قناديل ملك الجليل عن فتره الطاهر عمر والتصدير والتنظيم اللي صار في فلسطين اللي هو داخلي بدون اي تاثير ثاني حتى.
لا أنا ما عم بقول، بس بقول هن شو بيقولوا عننا، لأنه هن يعني we already had a thriving city culture before they arrived. They are the one who keep claiming that they have created the industry and they have organized it and brought it to the level of modernization that it was. Maybe they industrialized it, but we had our way of. They absolutely, absolutely, and exactly, because we didn't look at crops as an industrial product. It was something coming from the land. It was a bounty. I only discovered, and this is something that I'm actually trying to dig, but I can't find enough resources. كان يعملوا شيء اسمه زفة البردقان. أول ما يطلع أول حد تاجر بيطلع البردقان، كانوا يلبسوا جمال بألوان ورائع، ويحطوا لهم السجاد ويحملوا الصناديق، ويطلعوا كل أهل المدينة يزفوا ويهنوا هذا التاجر إنه بلش موسم البردقان. زفة البردقان في أجمل من هيك؟ يعني it's incredible. ما في، هو بالنسبة له الإسرائيلي بيجي بيطلع ماشين وبيطلع كلياتها يعني automated، وبالنسبة له he doesn't like he's not attached to the land. It's commodity as far as he's concerned. This is culture. Of course, absolutely. But I don't have enough access to them. This is, for me, I just discovered this 2 days ago, and I said, oh my God, how can I find the rest of the information about it? Because I can do an exhibition about this. Just سفة البردقان لحالها ما أعرف، لأنه بس ألاقي أغانيها وألاقي شو كان التراث اللي حواليها وكيف كانوا يجمعوا، بس تكوني حدا بيقدر يحكي له قصة عن زفة البردقان. يعني إذا حدا بيعرف حطوهم على التواصل معي. Please دخيل الله، لأنه أنا I'm sure if I go to يافا كمان, and my plan before COVID was to go and stay in Yaffa. I'm sure the information that will come out will be completely different, or it will be another layer and layer and layer will emerge out of it. Here I'm doing it from behind the computer, from resources that are accessible or not accessible. The Israeli library, I can only take so much, and then the others you have to be مثلا عندك ID. And the irony, I'm taking something about our land, our crop from the library. But I know what we have. I'm sure there is a wealth of information out there about this crop and how it was handled, and about this bounty, but where to find it? That's also colonization. I mean, that's the tragedy of colonization. Well, how to find it, where to find it?
أنا نصيب ملاحظة الوالد كان دائما يحكي لنا عن بلدان يافا، وبابا كان يقول أحسن بلدان بالعالم، هاي كانت مشهورة بالمقولات كانت طالعة من فلسطين يمكن بالعشرينات، يتغنى بالبلدان يافا ويقول لنا قد إيه كان عظيم وإن تجربته كانت مثيرة. أنا هذا سؤال، هل هالتغيرات بعد موجودة؟
لا للأسف no. It has been completely, Jaffa has been absorbed into Tel Aviv. The city has practically disappeared. It's expanded, يعني the land, they've expanded on the land. I only went to Jaffa for a very short visit. The land is with Israel يعني, and they didn't keep it because خلاص يعني now it doesn't have the value that it had at a certain period of time. For them, it's better to put real estate projects. But there might be some small parcels of land. And actually, Soha Shuman did a project a few years ago, apparently, a small video, 6-minute video about Webiyaratka. And you may know about Webiyaratina, how the Bayara that has been disappeared and the destruction that was, but I think it was in Gaza, not in Jaffa, that Israel would raise the orange groves, you know, one parcel at a time, and every time they would take a section and then destroy it. But the story that you're saying, Fatin, for me, this is how the orange story started. It started from people's story. This image was in 2013, and it really it was called The Fall, يعني القوة من الجنة. And it was based on stories of the paradise lost. The people sang the land as this land of bounty, but it was associated with the fragrance of oranges. As soon as you enter Jaffa, this fragrance of this blessed orange was just بتفيح بالهواء. It was not coming from research. It was coming بالفطرة, and somewhere where the stories that our parents, grandparents, others have told us, the image came from there, and then the research came almost 10 years later or 8 years later.
Maybe, I don't know, one can place who were the big families that were, behind these Webiyaratka and exported oranges. And the descendants, even we can trace some Lebanese families.
Yes, absolutely. Lebanese were big at home.
Yeah, and just see how much we did out there.
Yeah.
Because some of them, might still have some papers from their great grandfathers.
Absolutely.
For instance, I found papers from the 1920s from my father that I didn't do grandfather of the oranges. So maybe that would be one window to.
I met with one of the grandchildren of Sabanagh. They were, Lutfi Sabanagh, he is in his 80s. And I went and spent 3 hours with him and recorded the conversation. He was telling me he was 14 years old when they left. So it was incredible to have this first-hand account from people who can still tell about their groves, Webiyaratka, and 70 years onward. I mean, there's this love for the land that to get not only emotional, because it was associated with this incredible wealth, with this bounty, with this beautiful life in a way. I mean, because there were مواسم مرتبطة بمواسم بالبحرية. There were 40 different vocations tied around oranges. And Abu Jabin, he's one of the people who had زهدي أبو جبين بيقول كل حياة ما فينا نقول إلا كل شخص بيافا كانت حياته مرتبطة بالبردقان. It was a city in which it touched the life of everyone. So short of actually meeting these people and collecting their first-hand account, the next thing would be, let's say, to go to Yaffa. And as I said, Ali al-Bawab, in his Mawsu'a, he indicated some of the names, which I am now, like, made a list of who are some of the most, not the all powerful, but the larger and prosperous of بيارين أو اللي عندهم مزارع كبيرة. At least to build on it, but I'm hoping that this is a collective project. I think it'd be interesting to know
how much is the export today. I know all over.
It's less. Oh, Pakistan is not even among the 10 countries. It's not even among the.
Yeah, but still, in Europe, certain oranges are.
Yeah, but you know what they do? No, but they know what you do. La, they have sold it as a brand. So Israel took the name and they give it to Spain, to give it to South Africa, they give it to other countries. Yes, and they used it as a brand. So they can only create this particular crop, shamuti, and call it Java, and almost get royalty for Israel. It's insane. But there are no more crops. There are no more, because it's no longer profitable. Now 190 countries plant citrus, and it doesn't have its value the way it had in the 19th century. We have vitamin C, but citrus is still the #1 fruit in the world. It sells more than $5.18 trillion. That's the figure of 2018. And fragment, frata, 5 trillion and 1,800,000,000. So it's.
حدا عنده أي سؤال؟ شكراً كتير لحضوركم وشكراً لإيمان على وقتك وعلى كل المعلومات اللي قدمتيها. شكراً جزيلاً إيمان.
أنا بدي أتشكركم على حضوركم الكريم، وبتمنى أنه تساعدوني أكمل المشوار، أنه أي معلومة، أي يعني قصة، صورة، أنا عم بجمع، لأنه بالنسبة لي يعني هاي بس طبقة. وهذا الإشي مثل ما كان عم بقول عبد الله البياري، هذا برتبط على يعني واحد بيقدر يعمل عملية القياس ويقول قصة القطن الفلسطيني، قصة الزيتون، يعني كل كروب يمكن له خصوصيته. بس شكرا.
يعطيك ألف عافية.